Okay, this is Unit 2C. We're continuing with renal physiology, and this is on acid-base balance. Now, acids can give protons, a hydrogen ion, right? H+. And bases can accept that proton. If you look at the pH of the normal pH of body fluids, then in the arterial blood, the plasma is at 7.4 plus or minus 0.05. On the venous side and in interstitial fluid, it's slightly lower, around 7.35. And inside cells, it's around intracellular fluid, and pH is typically about 7. Anything above 7.45 would be, and we're talking now about the plasma and the arterial blood, anything above 7.45 would be alkalosis or alkalemia, and anything below, again in the arterial plasma, the pH, anything below 7.35 would be considered acidosis, sometimes also called acidemia, although alkalosis and acidosis are the two terms normally used. So you can see here that arterial blood is at this pH with that range, and the venous blood, and this is a log scale, so even a minor change is significant, so even that 7.35, 0.05 lower is not an insignificant difference. You should think or ask yourself, and the question is answered later, why is it lower in the venous blood than in the arterial blood plasma? Intracellular is even lower than that. We're not going to get into why exactly. Let's move on. Well, pH is determined by hydrogen ion concentration, essentially. Okay. So when you look at the concentration, and square brackets like that indicate concentration. So it's the hydrogen ion concentration. And most hydrogen ions in the body originate from cellular metabolism. Okay, so the metabolic activity, all the biochemical activity of these cells generate hydrogen ions. You have a breakdown of phosphorus-containing proteins, and there are many of the proteins in the body do contain phosphorus, and that releases phosphoric acid into the extracellular fluid. That's one source. You have anaerobic respiration of glucose, which is fermentation, lactic acid fermentation. That also contributes to the hydrogen ion concentration, therefore dropping pH. Fat metabolism, which will produce organic acids and ketones. Ketones are acidic. And transportation of carbon dioxide as bicarb also releases hydrogen ions, as you know, or should know by now. So all of these can contribute to the sources of hydrogen ions. Regulation is tightly controlled. It has to be controlled because the pH has to be maintained within a fairly narrow range. The reason for that is that many enzymes, virtually almost all enzymes are proteins. Proteins will change their shape under different pH conditions. So if you move outside of the physiological range of 7.35 to 7.45, you will get changes in the shape of enzymes, and a shape change will change the activity. So, for example, if you have a biochemical pathway made of, substrates, and then an enzyme turning that substrate into a product, and let's call this 1, and this is catalyzed by enzyme 1, and this is product 1, and product 1 is a substrate for another enzyme, so we'll call that substrate 2, and that's acted on by another enzyme, enzyme 2, and that forms product 2, which is the substrate for another enzyme, so that's now substrate, product 2 is substrate 3 for enzyme 3. So if you have this kind of a biochemical pathway, and some pathways are very long and have many enzymes, the whole pathway is dependent, this biochemical pathway is dependent on, in terms of the role that pH plays, it's dependent upon the most pH sensitive enzyme. So as the pH changes, enzymes will change, but the one that's most sensitive and changes the most so that its activity is significantly reduced, then the one that is most sensitive will lose function, and the whole pathway stops. And at that point, you start getting accumulation of this substrate, which was actually the same as product 1 here in this step, right? So, concentration of hydrogen ions is carefully controlled in the body, and there are a number of different systems that help maintain appropriate levels of hydrogen ions, in other words, appropriate pH levels. There are, in fact, regulatory systems that include chemical buffer systems, and they act very, very quickly within seconds. You also have the respiratory center in the brain stem, which can act within minutes. And then there are renal mechanisms. So there's respiratory system and renal mechanisms, which require step 2. The second one is respiratory. Third one is renal mechanisms, which require hours to days to be able to affect a pH change, but the pH change will be permanent, whereas with the respiratory system mechanism, it's only temporary. In terms of the first one, chemical buffering systems, and in general, for any consideration of pH, you have strong acids and weak acids. Strong acids will allow hydrogen ions to dissociate from them completely when they're in water. So they are extremely efficient donators of hydrogen ions. That means that they are strong acids. Weak acids will only partially dissociate the hydrogen ions, so they're pretty efficient at preventing big shifts in pH. Similarly, although the opposite, strong bases will dissociate easily in water and quickly tie up or take up hydrogen ions. So they have a strong effect in taking up hydrogen ions and raising pH. Weak bases accept hydrogen ions much more slowly, and good examples of that include bicarbonate and ammonia, amino groups. All right. Now, buffers are molecules that can act to resist pH changes when a strong acid or base is added to a solution. And there are three major chemical buffering systems in the body. There's the bicarbonate buffering system, the phosphate buffering system, and the protein buffering system. And we'll consider each of these separately in the next few slides. The changes in pH, any shifts in pH are resisted by all of these chemical buffering systems. And remember, they act almost instantaneously within seconds. In terms of the bicarbonate buffering system, if you have I remind you that of the equation of CO2 plus H2O going to carbonic acid, and then that dissociating to bicarbonate and hydrogen ions, and that goes in either direction. It can also go in the opposite direction. That is a major part of the bicarbonate buffering system in the body. And we discussed it when we reviewed cardiovascular and or respiratory function and the role of red blood cells in that kind of handling of CO2. Well, if you look at a mixture of carbonic acid and its salt, which is sodium bicarbonate, if a strong acid is added to this, then the hydrogen ions released will combine. The hydrogen ions released from the strong acid will combine with the bicarbonate and form carbonic acid, which is a weak acid. So bicarbonate, in other words, the presence of bicarb, okay? And remember, this kind of sodium bicarbonate, when it's in solution, it splits, so it's free. The bicarbonate is free from the sodium. So the presence of bicarb acts as a buffer, and it will buffer the effect of any strong acid. So the drop in pH when a strong, whatever potential drop in pH that might have occurred is prevented by the bicarb, which can take up hydrogen ions. If a strong base is added, it reacts with carbonic acid to form sodium bicarbonate, a weak base. So they come together and you have a weak base, and the pH solution rises only slightly. Remember, a rise in pH is what you get with basic solutions have a higher pH. They have a lower concentration of hydrogen ions. So the bicarbonate buffering system is extremely important in the body, and in fact it's the only important extracellular fluid buffer. So it's the only important one in the intravascular. Extracellular fluid, after all, is both intravascular and also interstitial fluid. Intravascular, and I'm not going to write them out, interstitial. So both those fluids are buffered by the bicarbonate buffering system. The phosphate buffering system acts similar to the bicarbonate system. Its components include sodium salts of dihydrogen phosphate, which is a weak acid, and monohydrogen phosphate, which is a weak base. And this is an effective buffer which acts in the urine and in the intracellular fluid. Remember, urine is not in your body, it's outside of your body. It's formed into a tubular space which is continuous with the outside of your body, outside of your tissues. So this phosphate buffering system is important in urine and intracellular fluid, and the bicarbonate buffering system is important in extracellular fluids. Okay, let's look at the protein buffering system. The proteins, all of them and you have a lot of proteins present in the plasma, and you also have proteins in the intracellular cytoplasm, are plentiful, powerful buffers. Some of the, as you perhaps remember, you have 20 different amino acids that make up proteins, and some have a free acid group, and those can act as weak acids, you know, if they have carboxy groups, for example, on them. And some can act as weak bases if they have, for example, amino groups. Remember that among the 20 different amino acids, you always have a central carbon atom and a R side chain, which differs between each of the 20 different amino acids. And then you have a hydrogen ion. We're looking at individual amino acids here, a carboxy group and an amino group on the other side. So this R side chain, some of them have organic acid groups they have within them, and others have amino groups, so they can act as weak acids, weak bases. I should point out to you that if you have a molecule that can have dual function, because one part of it is an acid and one part of it is base, can act as a base, then this is called an amphoteric molecule. And many proteins fall in that category because there's so many different areas of the molecule. There's so many amino acids in them that some areas are more basic and other areas are more acidic. So many can act as amphoteric molecules with both functions. So we looked at the chemical buffering systems, and now we'll look at the physiological buffering systems, and there are two. The respiratory system and the renal system. We'll look at them separately. Sometimes we'll discuss them together, but we'll do them sequentially. The two act to maintain a balanced pH, and they have a very important function. The respiratory system can change the pH in the body within a few minutes. Remember, the chemical buffering systems act instantly, almost within seconds. Respiratory system can act within a few minutes. It can cause shifts in pH. Anyone who ever has hyperventilated knows what a strong effect that has on them. They completely can, feel quite terrible in no time by hyperventilating. It's not a good thing. Hyperventilation, after all, we'll talk about hyperventilation in a few minutes. The renals, and any change that the respiratory system can affect is not permanent. It's very temporary, but it can act fairly quickly, and certainly the body does use it. Renal system buffering mechanisms act over a longer period of time and are permanent or more effective because the body actually gets rid of excess acid or excess base. Well, in terms of the respiratory system, it can regulate acid-base balance or pH. It's a physiological buffering system. We do, after all, have a reversible equilibrium between CO2 and water and hydrogen ions and bicarbonate, and the intermediate in between is the carbonic acid. This step is requires an enzyme to catalyze it, and the enzyme is called carbonic anhydrase, as you already know. The other step, dissociation, or in reverse reassociation, dissociation of carbonic acid to hydrogen ions and bicarb, or reassociation of hydrogen ions with bicarb, will occur spontaneously, and typically reactions occur if you have more reagents or reactants on this side than the other side, then the reaction tends to go this way. If you have more reagents or reactants on this side, then the reaction will tend to go the other way. All right. And here we have the respiratory system acting. If we're up in the lungs, then carbon dioxide is getting unloaded in the lungs. So what's happening is that the concentration of CO2 is, when the blood's in the lungs, the concentration of CO2 is diminishing because it's diffusing across into the alveolar space. So what happens is the reactants on this side are lower, and therefore, it's driving the reaction from right to left in that direction, as shown here. What you have is that the bicarbonate, which is in the plasma, will move back into the red cell, combine with hydrogen ions to form carbonic acid, and then that will get split by the catalytic activity of carbonic anhydrase to CO2 and H2O, and the CO2 gets blown off into the space of the lungs and removed. So that's what's happening during carbon dioxide unloading in the lungs, and also actually in the tissues. Well, let's just stick with the lungs. Well, if you have, again, I remind you the reaction can go in either direction, can move in either direction. If you have acidosis, then that means there's a high CO2 level and you have hypercapnia. Hypercapnia refers to high CO2 levels and results in acidosis, a rise in the hydrogen ion concentration, acidosis. In other words, the pH goes down. Okay. Now, the response to hypercapnia, pH is monitored. The level of pH is monitored by chemoreceptors. You have chemoreceptors that sensory neural tissue that responds and sends those signals back into the respiratory centers in the brainstem, and it triggers a response to cause outgoing signals to cause deeper, more rapid breathing to blow off the CO2. Once the CO2 is blown off, then the reaction above will move towards the left. Before that, when you have a high level of CO2, if the CO2 level is high, then what you're going to get, you see, if this is high, concentration of CO2 is higher, then the reaction will move this way. And if the reaction goes from left to right, that means that more hydrogen ions are being produced. And that's why a high CO2 level causes acidosis. If, however, your body responds and starts to breathe deeper, blows off more CO2, then the CO2 levels will drop and the reaction will start moving from right to left. Okay? And that's what's happening here, of course. As you breathe deeper and faster, you correct that acidosis, blow off more CO2. Alkalosis, the opposite condition, where the pH of the blood plasma is above 7.45. The respiratory response to that high pH is a slower, more shallow breathing. And when you breathe slower and more shallowly, then what happens is that CO2 starts to build up. Remember, with alkalosis, it's a question, a high pH is a question of having low hydrogen ion concentration. So the reaction will be going this way and you will have alkalosis. However, if you breathe more shallow and slower, then you get an accumulation of CO2. CO2 rises in concentration. Then the equation starts moving this way, reactions start moving that way, and hydrogen ions start to accumulate, and the pH rises back up into the normal range. So the reaction moves towards the right, and the hydrogen ion concentration rises, so the pH drops back into the normal range. So your respiratory system is, your nervous system, sensory nervous system, is constantly monitoring the pH. and will send the signals into your respiratory centers which respond by either breathing deeper and more rapidly or slower and more shallow to adjust pH. But that's something that is very difficult for the body to maintain for any prolonged period of time. The renal system, the renal physiological buffering system, is different in that with chemical buffers, you can tie up some excess acid and base, but they don't eliminate them from the body. The lungs, the respiratory buffering system, so chemical, respiratory, they can eliminate carbonic acid by blowing off CO2, but again, it cannot be maintained over a long term. Only the kidneys can actually get rid of acids. They can get rid of the metabolic acids like phosphoric, uric, or lactic acids or ketones, and therefore prevent metabolic acidosis. Acidosis, low pH, in other words, that occurs because of accumulation of metabolic products. So in the end, and they get rid of it and it's permanently gone. So in the end, the ultimate acid-base regulatory organs are in fact your two kidneys. All right, we're going to look at the actual mechanisms of how the kidneys keep a balanced level of pH, or maintain a balanced pH, how they handle acids and bases to maintain the proper pH. Now, the most important mechanisms that the kidneys mediate are reabsorption of bicarb or generating new bicarb or excreting bicarb. And we're going to handle these individually. In terms of controlling pH, if the kidneys are reabsorbing bicarb, and by reabsorption I'm talking, of course, from the filtrate that went into that goes out into the tubular system, or if they're generating new bicarb, and I'll show you what that means, then it's the equivalent of losing a hydrogen ion, and therefore the pH rises. So this is a mechanism to increase the pH if it's too low. These two, reabsorbing bicarb or generating a new bicarb. If the kidneys excrete bicarb, it's the same as gaining a hydrogen ion, and therefore that will cause a decrease in the pH. As the hydrogen ion go up, it's equivalent that occurs. The excretion of a bicarb is equivalent to gaining a hydrogen ion, and you'll see in the next few slides how that goes. All right. In terms of hydrogen ion secretion, it will occur or can occur in the proximal tubule and in the collecting ducts or collecting tubules. And that output of hydrogen ions will cause an increase in pH. Now, as you know, hydrogen ions come from the dissociation of carbonic acid in this reaction that you're familiar with. And this is an important reaction that is occurring continuously in the kidneys to one extent or the other, in one direction or the other. So the kidneys are able to secrete hydrogen ions directly, the ones that are produced from this. Let's look at it a little bit more. We'll start with reabsorption of bicarbonate. And it's a little maybe easier on the diagram, looking at the diagram in the next slide, but we'll go through it and then we'll look at the diagram also. I remind you that if you have reabsorption of bicarb, it's the equivalent to losing a hydrogen ion. Therefore, the pH will rise. What happens in this case during reabsorption of bicarb, the CO2 is combining with water to form carbonic acid, and then that splits into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate. And for every hydrogen ion that gets secreted into the, remember that you can't have secretion, for every bicarb that gets secreted into the tubular space, this reaction is occurring in the tubular cells, the cells that line the tubule. So for each hydrogen ion that gets secreted into the tubular space, a sodium and a bicarb are reabsorbed. And I remind you again, reabsorption of bicarb is the same as losing hydrogen ion. And so the pH rises. The secreted hydrogen ions that go into the filtrate will form carbonic acid. And in that way, if you form carbonic acid, remember through this reaction, if you're forming carbonic acid with the secreted hydrogen ions, then that means that bicarb is disappearing from the filtrate at the very same rate that it's entering into the bloodstream through reabsorption. Let's see what that means. So this is, again, the process of reabsorption of bicarb, which is the equivalent to losing a hydrogen ion, and therefore is a mechanism to raise the pH. And what you have, and we'll go through these numbers here, what you have is that carbon dioxide, which is going into the cells, this is in the proximal convoluted tubule. So on this side here, we have the filtrate fluid in the tubule. And here you have the proximal convoluted tubule cell right along the wall of that proximal convoluted tubule. And here you have the peritubular capillary, and CO2 is diffusing across, and it is going to form carbonic acid. So it's taking up, combining with water to form carbonic acid, and as you know, that will split spontaneously into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate. And the bicarbonate is getting reabsorbed. And the hydrogen ion is going out, is by secretion, is going out into the tubular space. Once it's in the tubular space, it's going to combine with bicarbonate to form carbonic acid. The carbonic acid will go to form CO2 and H2O, and the CO2 will come back in. So that's another source of CO2 there. The end effect is that hydrogen ions are secreted and bicarb is reabsorbed, and the reabsorption of bicarb therefore is the equivalent of hydrogen ion secretion, and therefore the pH goes up. So this would occur if the pH is too low in the body. Okay, that's a very important mechanism, reabsorption of bicarb to control pH, in this case to raise the pH if it's too low. The other mechanism that can occur is, in order to regulate pH, is generation of a new bicarb, a completely new bicarb. And that's the same again as losing a hydrogen ion, causing the pH to rise. Two mechanisms are carried out by cells that line the collecting ducts to generate new bicarb. And both involve the excretion, secretion and excretion, and or excretion of either hydrogen ions or ammonium ions. Ammonium is NH4 plus, hydrogen ions of course is H plus. Well, if you lose by excretion, excretion means out into the urine, what's going to be the urine. If you're losing hydrogen ions, then you're raising the pH. So this is what happens. This is another mechanism, and involves the generation of new bicarb. Okay, so in terms of generating new bicarb, hydrogen ions that you take in the diet, it has to be counteracted by generation of new bicarb. And this involves excreting hydrogen ions, and they'll bind to buffers in the urine. In fact, it binds to phosphate buffer. I told you the phosphate buffering system is a chemical buffering system that's active in the urine, and also I think in intracellular space, so in the cytoplasm. In any case, in this case, you have cells that line the collecting ducts actively secreting hydrogen ions into the urine, and then that gets buffered and excreted. At the same time, bicarb is generated and will move into the interstitial space and then into the peritubular capillary blood. And I'll show you the reactions here. So this is generation of new bicarbonate, and you can see it right there moving in through hydrogen ion, involving hydrogen ion excretion. This is again in response to acidosis, a low pH. Kidneys generate the new bicarb. It goes into the blood, and an equal amount of hydrogen ions are going into what will become the urine. And so in response, the pH goes up. So this involves this kind of reaction here. There is enough in there that this is occurring. New bicarb is forming and getting reabsorbed, and the hydrogen ions are going out. And they combine with the phosphate buffer and go out in the urine. Okay, so this is quite a lot simpler than the previous absorption or reabsorption of bicarb. It's not bicarb reabsorption, but generation of a new bicarb. So that was hydrogen ion secretion. And ammonium ion secretion. Here we have ammonium ions produced by metabolism of the amino acid glutamine in the proximal convoluted tubule cells that line the proximal convoluted tubule. For every glutamine that gets metabolized, and a lot of glutamine actually does get metabolized in the body, it's an important amino acid, and is actually in the during amino acid metabolism, a lot of the amino acids are being converted to glutamine and then go through a further metabolic event. But just to keep it focused on the kidneys, for every glutamine that is metabolized or broken down, you get 2 ammonium ions and 2 bicarb ions produced. So this is a new bicarb being generated. The bicarb moves into the blood, so that's movement in of a generation and movement in of a new bicarb, and the ammonium ions are excreted. So this is the second method through which, or mechanism through which new bicarb is generated, involving ammonium ion excretion. And here you see it again. What you have is new bicarb being generated and moving in, although it's not due to carbon dioxide and water, but instead glutamine in the cell, and that glutamine could come from either the blood or the filtrate, and you get bicarb and ammonium, and the ammonium goes out and the bicarb goes into the blood. The ammonium goes out in the ammonium ion will go out into the urine and be lost. Okay. All right. So that was two major mechanisms, and the second one having two subcategories, two major mechanisms of increasing the pH that the kidneys use. One is to reabsorb bicarb, and the other one is to generate new bicarb either by hydrogen ion excretion or by ammonium ion excretion. And the last mechanism or pathway that we were going to look at was involving bicarbonate secretion outwards. And of course, this is the same as gaining a hydrogen ion, and therefore if you gain hydrogen ions, it's a way to reduce the pH, to drop the pH when it's too high. So if the body is in alkalosis, the pH is too high, what you get, I wouldn't worry about which type exactly of the cells, but what you get in the collecting ducts is the following. You get a secretion out into the filtrate fluid that's going to become urine, a secretion of bicarb, and hydrogen ions being reclaimed into the blood, and therefore the pH drops. So this is actually the opposite of the reabsorption of bicarb that was described earlier, which is occurring in through another type of cell lining the tubules. Okay. All right, now we're going to talk about some metabolic events that occur which alter the pH in the body and are due to either the respiratory system or the renal system, causing changes. Here we're talking about respiratory changes in pH. So we're talking about metabolic situation in which acidosis or alkalosis is caused by the respiratory system. These changes in balanced pH from the normal balance level to either too acid or too basic result from the failure of the respiratory system. In the case of the PCO2, in this case the PCO2 or partial pressure of CO2 in the arterial blood is the single most important indicator that there's a inadequacy in the respiratory function. Now normally partial pressure of CO2 in the arterial blood is between 35 and 45. So it's hovering around 40 plus or minus 5. If it's above 45, then that indicates respiratory acidosis. And if it's below 35, then that indicates respiratory alkalosis. I would remind you that when CO2 is high, as indicated here, then this equation moves from left to right. And so what you get is an accumulation of hydrogen ions. So hydrogen ion levels are rising and you get acidosis. So this is respiratory acidosis. In contrast, if the CO2 level is low in the blood, you have respiratory alkalosis. And the reason is that with a low CO2, then that means that these components are higher in concentration, and the equation now starts to move instead from right to left. And so CO2 is building up and hydrogen ions are getting reduced, and therefore pH is rising and you're into alkalosis. And this is actually what happens with hyperventilation. A person is breathing too fast and too deep, or even not so deep normally, but too fast. And so they're blowing off CO2, so the PCO2 is dropping, and the hydrogen ion concentration is relatively higher, so it's going to start moving this way, and you're going to get less and less hydrogen ions as the CO2 gets blown out of the body, through the lungs, and so you go into alkalosis. So respiratory acidosis and respiratory alkalosis associated with changes in the balance in this reaction here, and result and are indicative of some sort of respiratory problem. In the case of respiratory acidosis, as I said, what you have is a high PCO2, and the equation is moving from left to right, and so hydrogen ions are accumulating, and you get into acidosis. And as you can see, the reaction goes that way, from left to right. And in the case of respiratory alkalosis, you have a PCO2 that's lower, and so the reaction is going from right to left, and hydrogen ions are being consumed in the production of carbonic acid that's going to CO2 and H2O, so pH is dropping as the hydrogen ions drop, and that's respiratory alkalosis. So in the first case, it's pH lower, going down, and second case, respiratory alkalosis, pH rising. That's what's happening with abnormal levels of PCO2, and the PCO2 again is a major indicator of these respiratory imbalances. In fact, respiratory acidosis is the most common cause of acid-base imbalance. It occurs typically when breathing is too shallow. In other words, the person's not ventilating their lungs appropriately, and or gas exchange is hampered by disease. Okay, and it can occur, for example, with pneumonia, where the certain areas of the lung are unavailable, or they're not adequately ventilated, and so the person can't blow off enough CO2, and the reaction is going from left to right, and there's more hydrogen ions being produced because the PCO2 is rising. It can also occur with cystic fibrosis, which is often associated with this kind of problem, and emphysema, where you have actually a pathological loss of lung tissue. So all of these can cause ventilation to be reduced, so gas exchange is hampered, and you end up with respiratory acidosis. Respiratory alkalosis, on the other hand, often is a result of hyperventilation. The cure, of course, is to give the person a paper bag and let them breathe, put that over their mouth and their nose, and let them breathe in and out into the bag. In that way, they will be rebreathing their CO2, their PCO2 will rise, and it will correct the alkalosis. When your PCO2 rises, you get more hydrogen ion. That biochemical reaction will start going this way, and the hydrogen ions will rise, and so it'll correct the alkalosis. So respiratory acidosis, respiratory alkalosis, both problems with pH balance that originate with the respiratory insufficiency. The other type of imbalance is metabolic acid-base imbalance. So we had respiratory and metabolic. And in metabolic imbalance, these kind of imbalances are caused by anything that except those associated with abnormal PCO2. Okay, so anything involving abnormal PCO2 levels in the blood, partial pressure of CO2 in the blood, are respiratory imbalances, either respiratory acidosis or respiratory alkalosis. If any pH balance is occurring other and not associated with that or caused by that, by CO2, abnormal CO2 levels, then it's a metabolic acid-base imbalance. And you look at the bicarb levels, and they will be higher or lower than normal. And the normal level is from 22 to 26 milliequivalents per liter. And let's look at particular examples of that. In metabolic acidosis, this is the second most common cause of acid-base imbalance. So the first was respiratory acidosis, and the second is metabolic acidosis. Those are the first and second most common acid-base imbalances that occur in people. The typical cause is ingestion of too much alcohol and excess loss of bicarb. Other causes may be an accumulation of lactic acid, or a person's in shock, or they are in it's ketosis, but it's actually ketoacidosis, and that's with uncontrolled diabetes or starvation. It can also occur with kidney failure. So metabolic acidosis is the second most common acid-base imbalance and associated with excess bicarb loss, excess alcohol intake. Metabolic alkalosis, an abnormal rise in the pH. You have a rising blood pH and bicarb, and that is indicative of metabolic alkalosis. The typical causes are vomiting and therefore loss of a lot of acid from the stomach, so chronic vomiting, loss of acid, hydrochloric acid gets replaced, keeps being lost from the body, so the person can go into metabolic alkalosis. Sometimes it's because of abnormal high levels of intake of base, and that can occur because the person keeps popping antacid tablets, and they take so many because of an upset stomach. It becomes habitual, and they take too much, and they go into metabolic alkalosis. And also constipation can lead to metabolic alkalosis because the material in the gastrointestinal tract stays there for so long that excess bicarb is getting reabsorbed in the gut. The gut will reabsorb bicarb, and if the material stays there for too long, then you're getting too much bicarb being reabsorbed. So, chronic vomiting of acid, chronic intake of excess base, or constipation leading to excess bicarb reabsorption can lead to metabolic alkalosis. Clearly, acidosis is a more common problem than alkalosis, and respiratory acidosis is the most common, then followed by metabolic acidosis, the second most common. Abnormality in pH levels. I'm not really sure about alkalosis, metabolic or respiratory, but I would guess metabolic alkalosis is more common than respiratory. Respiratory is really mainly associated, alkalosis is mainly associated with hyperventilation, which is, usually a temporary thing. So, in order to compensate for pH imbalance, both the respiratory and renal systems can kick in and try and correct. And typically an inadequacy in one physiological buffering system is compensated for by the other. So a respiratory So a metabolic imbalance will be corrected, or the respiratory system will attempt to correct metabolic imbalances, and respiratory imbalances will be corrected by, or attempted to be corrected by, the renal system. So renal will correct respiratory, and respiratory will correct metabolic imbalances. These are the two major buffering systems or mechanisms of imbalances generated, and these are the two physiological buffering systems. Respiratory tries to correct metabolic imbalances, and renal systems or kidneys try to correct respiratory imbalances. Let's look at respiratory compensation for metabolic acidosis. In metabolic acidosis, what you have typically is low pH, of course, acidosis. You'll see a low pH and a low bicarb level. The compensation, remember, metabolic acid imbalances are compensated by the respiratory system, so the compensation typically for metabolic acidosis is an elevated rate and depth of breathing. The person is trying to breathe off or lose more CO2 so that this equation gets driven from right to left. So in this situation, you have hydrogen ions being used up to move the reaction from right to left, and in that way the pH will rise. Okay, so compensation is exhibited by the response to the respiratory system, allowing carbon dioxide to get blown off, removed, in other words, from the blood by the being blown off through the lungs. As the carbon dioxide gets eliminated, as I said, the correction gets revealed because the PCO2 falls back to below normal levels, and so that's why you have this low PCO2. PCO2 is getting blown off because of the elevated rate and depth of breathing. And it's falling below normal levels, and the pH is rising. If that mechanism is effectively responding and correcting the metabolic acidosis, then the pH will rise. What about respiratory compensation for metabolic alkalosis? In this case, you have a high pH, right? And you'll see a high PCO2 and high bicarb. Compensation is via the respiratory system for this metabolic imbalance. Metabolic alkalosis is exhibited by slow, shallow breathing. This, of course, allows the carbon dioxide to accumulate in the blood. If carbon dioxide is accumulating, then the equation is driven from left to right, and hydrogen ions will start to accumulate, and you'll get a drop in the pH if that's working with the accumulation of hydrogen ions. There'll be a rise, of course, in the PCO2 because of the slow, shallow breathing, and that drives the the equation this way. I remind you again, biochemical reactions occur. If they can occur in either direction, they will typically move from the side with the more substrates or reactants to the other opposite side. It'll get pushed that way, or vice versa. If the other end has higher concentrations of reactants, then it'll get pushed in the opposite way. So for metabolic alkalosis, the person breathes shallow and slow, is accumulating more CO2 in their blood plasma, and there's a rising CO2, and the reaction goes from left to to right, and you get a drop. If effective, if it's working to correct this, then the pH will drop. So those are the respiratory responses of the respiratory system, the respiratory buffering system to abnormal pH due to metabolic acidosis or metabolic alkalosis. In contrast, the compensation for respiratory imbalances is through the kidneys, the renal compensation for respiratory imbalance of acid-base. These mechanisms kick in if you have a respiratory basis for the imbalance, and in this way the kidneys can regulate the plasma pH. It's slower than respiratory compensation. Respiratory compensation and metabolic imbalance can be quite quick, but difficult to sustain for a long time, whereas renal mechanisms that kick in to compensate for respiratory imbalance act slower, but have a greater ability to restore values to normal for the pH, because they are you're permanently gaining or losing hydrogen ions through the, again, the mechanisms I described earlier of reabsorption or generation of new bicarb or secretion of bicarb. So, renal compensation for respiratory acidosis. The renal mechanism kicks in to compensate for this. Typically, it's acidosis, so you have a low pH. Typically, there would be a high PCO2 and a high bicarb level associated with this. In fact, the high PCO2 is the cause of the acidosis. Remember, this occurs in people who have trouble blowing off enough CO2 to maintain a balanced level of pH in their body. Respiratory rate is often depressed, or somehow ventilation of the lungs is poor in some or many areas, and that's the cause of the acidosis because of a buildup of CO2. High bicarb levels indicate the kidneys are retaining bicarb in order to counteract the acidosis. So in this case, you have high PCO2 because of the respiratory insufficiency leading to respiratory acidosis, and the presence of high bicarb levels indicates that you have the renal mechanism kicking in and you're getting retention of bicarb to offset the acidosis. If it works, then, if enough bicarb is being retained, either through reabsorption or generation of new bicarb, then the pH will rise and the acidosis will be corrected. In terms of renal compensation for respiratory acid-base imbalance that leads to respiratory alkalosis, here what you have typically is the respiratory system is acting to cause a high pH, and typically that's a result of hyperventilation. They're blowing, so alkalosis, they have a high pH, abnormally high pH. They're hyperventilating, they're blowing off too much CO2, so the PCO2 will be low, and bicarb levels will be low. The kidneys will eliminate, if this is, over a long period of time, hyperventilation for too long, kidneys start to eliminate bicarb from the body. They'll not reabsorb it, reclaim it, or they'll secrete it. So more bicarb will be going out, and that will compensate for the abnormally high pH alkalosis. So that means a loss of bicarb and correction of pH in that way. Okay, there are, and these are the final few slides, there are, and this covers a lot of territory and very, very, very briefly, too briefly, but age-related aspects of acid-base imbalance, the homeostatic mechanisms that control balance, all of the homeostatic mechanisms typically slow down or less effective with age. And, you know, a lot of problems may occur in terms of acid-base or fluid balance. The elderly often are unresponsive to thirst, things that trigger thirst. So they're more at risk of dehydration because they will not respond and get thirsty when they should. When they're, for example, their osmolality of the plasma is rising and they should be drinking more. Very young and very old often are the victim of fluid, acid-base, and electrolyte imbalances. Small infants don't have good control of fluid balance and acid-base electrolyte regulatory mechanisms, and you know, they can quickly deteriorate. The nice thing is that people can quickly bounce back, particularly small children, if they have a fluid imbalance or electrolyte imbalance, which can be associated with acid-base imbalance. Then, if treated, they can quickly bounce back. I mean, it's miraculous. Very old also can have problems with these. So it's at the extreme outliers in age that are the most frequent, most frequently have problems with these. The problems in the young typically reflect low residual lung volume, high rate of fluid intake and output. They really, you know, they put out a lot of, infants put out a lot of fluid, they need a lot of fluid intake. They have a higher metabolic rate, which leads to more metabolic waste products. They lose a lot of insensible water, breathing it off, perspiring, and they can lose quite a bit more than, this is in the very young. And insufficiency of the kidneys. The kidneys are not working the same way as in older children and infants. The kidneys put out the reabsorption is not occurring as it should, as it will in older children, and so they need to be replaced regularly. Okay, so that's the end of this unit, Unit 2C, and also the end of renal physiology.